Welcome to The Green Fix. In this podcast, we explore how businesses are navigating a changing world through the lens of supply chains, sustainability, and tech.
Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. Welcome to The Green Fix. I'm Dan Leverington.
And I'm Loreto Gutierrez.
We're thrilled to be joined today by Chris de Cuyper, co-founder and managing director of Fremantle Seaweed. Chris is an entrepreneur, surfer, and engineer who recognised seaweed's potential to combat climate change. Chris, welcome to The Green Fix.
Thanks for having me, Dan and Loreto. It's great to be here.
Very excited to speak to you about this today. Before we get into the science, can you just take us back to what actually started your journey to create Fremantle Seaweed?
Okay, so it's 2020. Everything's changed in the world. My background before that, I was a mechanical engineer, and I'd managed to get my way onto this amazing construction project where we built a surf park in Melbourne, so the Urban Surf Park. I put so much of my time and energy into it. Like I said, I'm a lifelong surfer. I love the ocean. And I thought, okay, well, I'll use my engineering skills to figure out a way that we can make mechanical waves. And funnily enough for me, it just didn't compare. I just found myself driving down the coast. I'd go and surf down in Torquay as much as possible. COVID hit and everything changed. I just really wanted to come back to Western Australia. Right as that happened, I watched a documentary. I think I was in lockdown in Melbourne, and I watched this documentary called 2040 by Damon Gameau. And obviously he's been on your podcast too. And it was just that call to action I needed. There was a whole range of solutions that we have for climate change. And I loved the positivity. I loved the fact that we can take climate action right now. And, that was in 2020. Fast forward to 20 years to 2040, that positive impact we can have. And the one that resonated for me was seaweed. So I went on a deep dive with seaweed after that. And fast forward 6 years and we're here now.
And we're really excited to hear more about Fremantle Seaweed and everything that you've been doing in these last 6 years. But before we do that, I think it would be really valuable to set the context around the problem that you're trying to solve. Would you be able to explain to us what is the relationship between livestock and methane?
Ruminant livestock, so that is cows, sheep, goats, camels, basically any livestock that has a rumen stomach. It's basically a big gassy balloon. It's their first stomach. So that's what we would call ruminant livestock, but particularly cows. So in their rumen, as they're eating, whether it's grain or grass, there is an enzyme in the rumen stomach that produces methane as part of its natural processes. So this is what CSIRO discovered, that by feeding asparagopsis feed supplement, you can inhibit that enzyme that produces the methane. To answer your question, relationship between methane and livestock, it's for all ruminant livestock, but cattle are by far the biggest contributors of methane. And methane it's important to talk about methane as well. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So if you average it out over 100 years, it's 28 times more potent than CO2 in the atmosphere as far as its warming effect, yet it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. So it's one of those, you can kind of call it the low-hanging fruit of the greenhouse gases. If we do something about methane right now, we can actually have a major impact to reducing the warming effect.
One of the things we'd like to understand is what is exactly the environmental impact of livestock?
Yeah, look, so in Australia, cattle make up 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's about 5%. We've just got a lot of cows here in Australia. Yet it's so challenging. It's a really what we call a hard to abate sector. Cattle farms are so important. They're providing beef and dairy products that feed the world. We're only going to need more beef and dairy as human populations increase. So it's not like you can just turn this sector off and say, okay, we'll stop producing beef and dairy and that'll fix the problem. We don't even really have an energy transition for cattle. We can't really transition away to a different lower producing livestock. So what we need to do is provide these farmers with the tools they need. There's obviously so many factors to climate change, and the one that we really saw that we could have a big impact was getting our seaweed supplement to cattle farmers.
And so from the cattle and the livestock on land, we'd love to now dive into the weeds and actually get an understanding of what is the science within seaweed that allows this incredible incredible transformation to take place. And can you give us an idea of the research that CSIRO published? And then also a little bit about the seaweed itself, like in terms of location, water temps, and what are those kind of growing conditions that you're looking for?
So to start with the science, you discovered by CSIRO, James Cook University, and Meat and Livestock Australia, and they commissioned some research to test a range of Australian seaweed species and their effects to reduce methane in cattle. The lead scientist, Dr. Robert Kinley, when they were testing various seaweeds, he actually thought his instruments were broken when they got the results about asparagopsis, because I think at the time it was a 98% reduction. The trials they were doing where they basically built the conditions of a cow's rumen stomach. So they modeled it and they saw that effect. So then they really did a deep dive on asparagopsis and how it can reduce that the enzyme that produces the methane. Asparagopsis is cool as well. So as a seaweed, it's just a really good carrier of the bioactive, which is called bromoform. It's a halogenated gas that inhibits from producing methane. Being a halogenated gas, it's highly volatile. So asparagopsis does this amazing job as the seaweed of containing that bioactive, the bromoform, and really delivering it in a package that can be used for cattle farmers for their existing dosing systems, particularly in feedlots. Once it's stabilized, the seaweed, it basically has a shelf life of about a year and it can be dosed really effectively to cattle. So it probably answers the science behind how the seaweed does it. And then there's a whole other side of how to grow asparagopsis seaweed. And I kind of go back to 2020 when I founded Fremantle Seaweed. There was other companies, pioneers that had already started their journey, but no one had really known how to grow asparagopsis seaweed on commercial agriculture equipment before. And we're 6 years in now. I'd still say it's fairly early days. We've got a long way to go. We can very effectively grow part of the life cycle of asparagopsis, which is called a tetrasporophyte. There's two parts of the life cycle. There's a gametophyte, which is when you would see it in its natural environment on local reefs here, attached to a reef. And then if you Google an image of asparagopsis seaweed, you'll see these beautiful sort of red frond-like seaweed. It is a really pretty seaweed underwater. But that other phase of it is just free floating in the ocean, and it's called a tetrasporophyte. So we can grow that in tanks. There's certain tanks called photobioreactors, which is a tank where you attach lighting to it, really control the temperature and the aeration. You can get really good growth. There's other ways you can do it, and they're called raceway ponds, which is basically like an open top, larger pond where you can really scale up what you can do in a photobioreactor. I would say the problem we've encountered in the industry is it can be done, but at a certain point, you can't continue to scale it. It's something like 1 million litres of water in tanks is enough to do about 20,000 head of cattle, which is great. But if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of head of cattle, millions of head of cattle, you're talking about billions of litres of water in tanks. There's this point where you're not going to scale up to 1 billion litres of seawater in tanks. Keeping in mind, when you grow seaweed in a tank, you also grow a lot of other things. So those tanks have to be cleaned. It's big capex, big opex to build and operate a tank farm of that size. So what we can do and what we're doing here at Fremantle Seaweed is a process called tetrasporogenesis, which I won't ask anyone to repeat. But basically that tetrasporophyte that I was talking about before, that's free floating, when it goes through its reproduction phase, it produces a whole bunch of tetraspores, which then grow out to the gametophyte. So as an industry, we had to figure out that process. And it's really about the ecology of the seaweed, learning similar in nature as the light conditions change, as the season change, the amount of light per day reduces, the water temperature reduces as well. So we were able to find the right conditions to induce that spore release or the tetrasporogenesis. That's been figured out. We're doing that at our hatchery facility that we're operating at the moment. And we've also identified a really high performing strain where we get really good amounts of tetraspores to come out of the tetrasporophyte. We then get those tetraspores that have been released in the hatchery. We get them to attach to rope. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks for them to grow up. And at the start, they're microscopic. And then after about 6 to 8 weeks, you can see a red fuzz on a rope. And that's the baby gametophytes of the asparagopsis. We then take those ropes out to our seaweed farm. So we have a fully approved 32 hectare seaweed farm here in Fremantle where we call them backbones, but basically it's anchor ropes and chains in the ocean. and they provide us some structure to hang those seaweed grow ropes off of. So from there, it grows out for another 8 to 10 weeks to its full maturity, and we can harvest it. And that's when we're harvesting the full gametophyte. So there's these two ways to grow it. We're doing both at our facility. And with a lot of detail there. But I think what people really need to focus on, two parts of the life cycle, free floating in the ocean and attached to the reef. In aquaculture setting, we can mimic both. And one, allows a lot of scale, which is growing it out in the ocean.
That was amazing. Thank you. One of the things that we often reflect on is the climate sustainability nature space is full of people who had careers outside of the industry, who have brought that knowledge into the industry to have a huge outsized impact. How do you think about your background and the influence that it has had on the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a combination for me for my career and also my recreational life as a surfer. I started my career, I was an apprentice electrician and I became a mechanical engineer later, but I started my career as an electrician. I was working on this island called Barrow Island, which is in the northwest of Western Australia. And it's beautiful. It's part of an island chain called the Montebello Archipelago. Really remote, like amazing marsupials that you don't find on the mainland that have survived out there. It's just such a beautiful area, and I'd always wanted to go back there. And I'll get to that later in the story. So then, I went through my career, always as a surfer as well. I really like surfing the waves off Rottnest Island, really good reef breaks. So I've always had a boat. So I know these waters really well around Fremantle. So I've kind of always had a good understanding of the coastline, of the various areas within the local waters that, I know that area is quite protected by Garden Island and Karnak Island, except if there's a big northerly front coming through. So just kind of the understanding of the weather conditions, the sea conditions, but then going through my career in the resources sector and then into construction, I learned a lot of things about the project delivery. So I think that's what I can really bring to the asparagopsis discovery, that ability to get it from an idea to an actually operating seaweed farm. Now I'm looking back to the Northwest where we've got our existing seaweed farm here in Fremantle, 32 hectares with 14 long lines. We've been able to deliver that, constructing our seaweed hatchery and nursery, but we'll need to expand our operations. And from what I know of the West Australian coastline, one of the areas that we've applied for is that area where I used to work right at the start of my career, because it does provide the same protection. You can't do seaweed farming in the open ocean. It's just too rough. You can't operate a boat maybe 10 days a year. The winds are light enough here in Western Australia, but most of the time, it's just not feasible. So you need to find these areas that have protection from islands, whether it's here in Fremantle, we got Coburn Sound and the protection of the islands, or the Montebello Archipelago, where there's a series of islands. And a really cool thing we're looking to do there is set up this large-scale seaweed aquaculture hub, really leveraging the oil and gas assets that are on those islands already. They've got access to power, to water, to accommodation, and they're also decommissioning a lot of these end-of-life oil assets. We can repurpose them to support our seaweed aquaculture. So it's a pretty cool transition from infrastructure that's been a big part of the problem and produced a lot of hydrocarbons over the years. Let's repurpose these into something that can actually be a big part of the solution for climate change with asparagopsis, as a feed supplement for cattle farmers.
Yeah. Wow. That tie-in is really important, and how you've been able to bring that experience to the work you're doing. Such a good story and very inspiring as well for a lot of people that are thinking about how do I use my skills to do good. Really, really inspirational. One thing we know is that you traveled, as part of your research, you traveled to South Korea, of all places. So you're curious about that. Why South Korea, and what did you learn there?
Yeah, so it wasn't just me. It was the Australian Sustainable Seaweed Alliance arranged a number of delegates from the seaweed industry. So it was sponsored by DFAT to go over to South Korea and see how they're farming seaweed at a large scale. Yeah, it was a really great trip. It inspired me just to see that in South Korea, they've got something like 100,000 hectares of seaweed farming operations, but they've only been doing it since the 60s or the 70s. So post the Korean War, there had been existing small cottage industry of seaweed farming, but not the scale that they're doing it now. The Koreans are really good at this. They've done that with whether it's shipbuilding or electronics. But seaweed's another example of really mimicking the Japanese model. They have similar water conditions to grow a seaweed called gin, which we know as nori, and it's a species called porphyra. They're doing it at such a large scale now. I believe they've overtaken Japan as far as cultivation of gim or nori seaweed. And it's a complicated seaweed to grow. It's intertidal, which means part of the day it's out of the water. During low tide and high tide, it's underwater. So to grow it on aquaculture gear, they have to flip it every 12 hours. It's actually more complicated to grow than asparagopsis. And then if you look at Korea as an economy, like pretty similar GDP to Australia, it can be done in a really advanced country like Korea at a large scale. So that inspired me because when you're starting up a brand new industry in Australia and you see all the challenges ahead of you, you need those other countries to give you inspiration. We're fortunate here in Australia that asparagopsis grows better here than anywhere else in the world. Its kind of latitudinal band is the south coast of Australia and its northern limit is Indonesia. But on those limits, the south coast and the north limit of Indonesia only grows for about 2 to 3 months of the year. So here in Western Australia, we kind of get it year round, which is pretty handy for us.
Super fascinating and sounds like a great trip as well. We would love to now flip the switch and talk about the business itself, right? So Fremantle Seaweed, you've been going now for quite a few years. Of course, to be a successful business, this cannot be just a climate story. It cannot be just a sustainability story. It also has to be a financial story. So what do you think is the scale of the opportunity for seaweed farming in both Australia but also globally?
Yes, basically it's just a really big market. If you're looking at all the feedlot cows that we know about in the world, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand. I think we got numbers for China, but the majority of the feedlot cows in the world, we're talking about a $35 billion market for feed supplements. So it's a big, big market opportunity. We're getting a lot of market pressures from government supermarkets that are really asking cattle farmers to start thinking about reducing emissions. In Australia, I think we're going to lead the way, which is pretty cool. A few reasons for it. Asparagopsis as Australian innovation from CSIRO. It's worth about $1.5 billion here in Australia. It's a bit smaller, but we still do have a lot of cows. And at the moment, I'd say that the constraint is the supply of seaweed. It's like I said, we're 6 years in. We've got a long way to go to really start getting large supply of asparagopsis seaweed to the market. So it makes sense to go to Australia first. We're getting some really good incentives here in Australia, and it's through an ACCU methodology, so an Australian carbon credit unit, I believe is really going to drive that large-scale adoption of asparagopsis seaweed.
For sure. And we know the past 2 years have seen a lot of growth for the company. How do you think about where you're at on the scaling journey that you just referred to?
6 years in, I reckon we're just almost at the end of our commercialization piece. I always compare myself to other startups, particularly tech startups, where they don't have to raise much money. They can, develop an app in a few months and start getting revenue in. Everything just seems to be shorter timeframes. With asparagopsis, we have had to raise a lot more money for the infrastructure requirements, the hatchery, the nursery facility. We're really fortunate here. The West Australian government supported us with a $4 million government grant, really to purchase that infrastructure we needed. So the hatchery, the boats, long lines out of the seaweed farm. We've got the infrastructure in place. Next up is our commercial feedlot trial. With asparagopsis, you become a sub-licensee of the CSIRO patent, which is the commercial entity that manages that, is called Future Feed. So to be able to sell asparagopsis seaweed to cows, we have to become a licensee of Future Feed. So we're in that process at the moment of securing that license. Once we do, we'll start our commercial feedlot trial. That basically is part of this commercialization piece where we can show that our product formulation is correct. We have the right amount of bromoform, which is 6 milligrams per gram of asparagopsis, and that we can then dose it correctly for cattle feedlot systems. The CSIRO don't want to see us go in and dose too little or too larger amounts. We've really got to get that consistent dosing just to show that, we have the ability to supply enough seaweed. Once we've completed that commercial feedlot trial, the cattle farmers we're working with, which is Pardue Wagyu Corporation and Cuyper Feedlot, we're in discussions with them to have an offtake agreement from the initial supply from our 32-hectare seaweed farm. as we look to then scale up operations elsewhere. But at that point now, getting pretty close to the end of commercialization. On completion of that is growth phase.
And you've actually just touched on a few things that relate to how you started the business. You've got the WA government grant. You mentioned a couple of early partnerships that you've already established. For the listener that's keenly interested in the world of startups and entrepreneurship, can you share a little bit of that journey of getting that initial funding and how did you build those initial commercial partnerships?
Yeah, so had the initial idea, did all the sort of market research, realized it was a really good idea. So incorporated the business, and that was idea August 2020, incorporated in October 2020. And then we managed to secure 200K of angel investment by May 2021, which really got us started to start applying for a seaweed farm, move things along a fair bit. You can't really do much without the capital. So yeah, an amazing angel investor backed us early. We did a couple of other angel rounds, and then we did our first equity crowdfunding, so crowdsource funding. That was on a platform called Birchall. That was March 2024. We raised $1.2 million, which was awesome. We brought on 900 shareholders. The way equity crowdfunding works is even as a private PTY Ltd company, they only take up one position on our cap table. It was cool to see there was a lot of local support. I think a lot of investors saw the commercial benefits of asparagopsis. It's a huge market opportunity. But then alongside that, they wanted to see their money taking climate action. And I think they see climate action as good business now. So fast forward to October last year, we did our second equity crowdfunding round. We raised 2.2. So all up now, we've raised 4 million of equity, which has been matched by our 4 million state government grant. So we've raised $8 million. So it's a decent chunk of money. We've tried to do things in a really measured way. So yeah, that was October 2025. We closed that crowdsource funding round, and that has got us in a position where we've got the infrastructure we need to now scale and produce as much as seaweed as we need for the commercial feedlot trials.
And with that demand, where are you seeing that coming from globally? And how are the international markets responding to this as both a climate solution, but also the financial asset class as well?
Obviously, initial demand will be with those first moving cattle farmers that really see the writing on the wall, that they're going to have to get ahead of this, that there'll be incentives to start using feed supplements to reduce methane. Demand is much higher than the supply, which is good for us, but we do need to do whatever we can at the moment to increase supply to meet that demand. Global markets, I'd say Europe's going to be the next main jurisdiction outside of Australia. Mostly the fact that asparagopsis is approved for use in the EU. You still have to go through their approval process. Asparagopsis not yet approved for North America or other jurisdictions, but Future Feed and CSIRO are working on that. With that supply lagging demand, we'll work on Australia first, really showcase how well it's working here. Talk about the financial markets. The one that has really interested a lot of people at the moment is the fact that an ACCU methodology has been announced. And it's been a big shift, I'd say, that all of a sudden people are starting to see, okay, at a large scale, this is a big carbon project. So all of those, the funds that are looking to target and secure carbon credits, all their focus is really now on feed supplements like asparagopsis.
And do you see the use of ACCUs, so the Australian Carbon Credit Units, being used as a method or a vehicle to fund climate projects? How do you see that shaping up?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, we can secure offtake agreements once the ACCU methodology has been approved. So it'll take 18 months, 2 years to be approved. But once it is, and we're already in discussions with customers that need ACCUs, we're really lucky here in Australia with the safeguard mechanism that the biggest polluters have been baselined. Unless they reduce their emissions, they're going to have to purchase carbon credit. So we can use that as a way to fund these types of projects that are going to be able to, whether it's sequester or for us, abate emissions. The way we're looking at it, to fund the large-scale project that we want to do in the Northwest, at 3,000 hectares, we can do that with asset finance. Basically, pre-selling carbon credits under an offtake agreement, be it likely at a reduced price, to be able to fund a project, which, for our existing investors is pretty attractive because, it means that further rounds, unless they participate, they're not going to get diluted.
Yeah, wow. That's really fascinating. And you've talked a lot about scale and growth. It'd be interesting for us to understand what that looks like in reality. When we talk about expanding the sea farm, are we talking about hectares? Are we talking production? What is the cattle impact? And how does that translate to revenue? But more importantly, what is the carbon abatement potential from business?
The high level numbers. So for us, 32 hectares can feed about 4,500 head of cattle. Roughly that's about $1 million of revenue. It's a really good start. It's kind of our pilot site, but you can see from those numbers we need to scale up. And really, it's so we can have the impact. 3,000 hectares at our current yield. So we know we can do 3 tons per hectare of seaweed. If I look what I saw in South Korea with nori, they're doing about 20 tons per hectare of nori, very similar red seaweed species, similar size. So I believe we can get those yields up. But on our current conservative forecast, we're doing 3 tons per hectare because we can do it. But at 3,000 hectares, that'd be enough to do about 400,000 head of cattle, which is, so it's a decent amount. It's about 20% of the Australian feedlot sector. That's 115 mil in revenue, ongoing operational costs of about $11 million a year, cost about $50 million to set up a big seaweed farming or aquaculture hub in the Northwest. So you can see where that asset finance comes in really handy. Based on those numbers, they're pretty compelling. And then you look at the carbon side of it. So 3,000 hectare site would be doing about 900,000 ACCUs. It's a significant carbon project. And that's where the discussions we're having at the moment, people are getting really interested in that carbon part of it.
Yeah, that's really exciting and really exciting impact. Chris, has been really, really, not just a really lovely conversation, but it's also been so interesting learning about the work that you're doing, how you've set up your business, the science behind it, and what you're looking to do. So we really, really appreciate you sharing all of these insights. Before we wrap up, I would love to know if you have one key takeaway from the conversation that you are keen to share.
Yeah, look, to summarize it, asparagopsis, an amazing Australian innovation, fully approved, ready for Australian cattle farmers to use, particularly effective in a feedlot setting. And they can reduce their methane emissions. They get the 7% feed conversion efficiencies. It's already working, and we're now in that process of scaling up. For us, we're looking to complete our seed round. We opened our seed round last year. We raised 2.3, and we've got a further $2.86 million to raise. The use of funds there really is to complete the commercialization journey, at which point, we'll have our first offtake agreements in place. We'll be in that growth phase, which is where we're looking to fund it with the asset finance from ACCUs. We've been a pretty busy last couple of months. We're talking to a lot of investors at the moment. If there is any investors that are listening to this, I would say that it has become a lot more de-risked asparagopsis as an investment opportunity, various reasons that we've talked about in this podcast. So if you are interested, please reach out. We're having some really constructive conversations with investors at the moment, and really keen to work with that really like-minded investors that see the potential and want to come on that journey with us.
For sure. And we will definitely put all of those details in the obligatory show notes for the podcast. But we also want to thank you for joining us today. It's incredibly impressive to see what you've built in such a short period of time and what clearly has such a huge amount of room for scale and impact. One of the themes that has kept on coming up since we first started the podcast is this idea that Australia does a great job of the research and the innovation, and then closing that gap of commercialization to scale and growth can be really tough. But as you've said, with such a compelling nature-based solution that not only for Australian farmers, but also around the world, really is important for Australian sustainability people and investors to be keeping on their radar options for solutions like you guys at Fremantle Seaweed. So thanks for coming on the Green Fix, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Loreto. It's great to be here.
This was Green Fix with your hosts, Loreto Gutierrez and Dan Levington. You can get your Green Fix every 2 weeks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Pocket Casts.